from coal, of course, is extremely important for the Chinese economy, and the Chinese economy is in focus today. The American election, thankfully, is now out of the way. Now we focus on the Chinese election, if we can call it an election. Let me just read you something from the Financial Times of this morning. It says here, when Chinese President Hu Jintao addressed his comrades at the opening of the 17th Communist Party Congress 5 years ago, he used the word Minzu, democracy, 69 times. In addition to talking about grassroots democracy, it goes on to say socialist democracy and intra-party democracy. Mr. Hu explained how the party was building a rich, strong, democratic, civilized and harmonious, modernized socialist country. And I suppose over the last 5 years, that's exactly what has happened. Can it continue? Will it continue? In the studio with me is Charles Robertson, Global Chief Economist at Renaissance Capital. Charles, thanks very much for joining us this lunchtime. What are your hopes for this latest Congress starting tomorrow?
Well, what we're reading is that you're going to get the two reform guys, Li and Xi, being put in the presidency and the premiership jobs, but the Conservatives are going to capture a lot of the Central Committee. So you're actually going to have the split in the Communist Party about where to go next and how to do it being quite problematic. And the positives on the reform front are going to be offset by the fact that the Conservatives are so strong.
Are there still hardliners within the party that want to go back to the old days or hold on to the old days, but at the same time conceding that they need to have a little bit of free market thinking as well?
There seems to be a very large faction that still believes the state knows best. The state knows how to run things best. The state should own the banks. The state-owned enterprises should need to be kept under their control. And I think this tension is going to build and build over the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think we've got more than another 2 Congresses to go in China before it's a full democracy.
So people actually going to the polls and voting?
That's the Chinese have got to the wealth level now of about $7,000 per head, and above 6,000 countries shift to democracy unless they export oil. But if you don't export oil above $6,000, you shift to
Is this a historical
democracy.
statistic you're giving us?
This is a fact based on the study of all the countries we've looked at since 150 years. And when those countries shift, there's only very, very few exceptions. 2 or 3 years ago, those exceptions were Singapore, which is a city-state, and it is the most interesting exception. Belarus and Cuba and Thailand was one, but that's gone to democracy. And
Azerbaijan?
No, that doesn't count as a democracy. It's an oil exporter as well, and it won't shift. So China, though, has gone into that group. And the model that we should be looking at now is Korea or Taiwan. And Taiwan, I think, is the more relevant. You had the Kuomintang, strong party in charge of Taiwan for 40 years, did a great job. They transformed that economy from an agrarian whole, really, to something much, much more impressive. And yet, the tensions in the party built through the 80s. Environmental concerns began to matter to the Taiwanese. The middle class got bigger. And the Communist Party, the Kuomintang, eventually said, OK, we'll accept elections in 92. Interestingly, they didn't lose those elections, or indeed the next ones. They didn't lose the elections until the year 2000, but they had given in to democracy by 1992. And I think where we are relatively in China is we're in the early 80s. We're at the equivalent for Taiwan. And that tells us that we'll have this Congress, maybe one more. By 2022, there'll be elections at municipal level, there'll be new parties.
Just because of a natural progression, a natural historic progression, or just because the population will demand it?
Both. The population will demand it, they'll be rich enough. And the Communist Party itself will no longer be able to agree on best policy.
Let me read you something else from this FT article, Charles, if I can. Even the People's Daily, it says here, the official mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, said in an editorial this week that as public awareness of the right to know and participate, as well as the rule of law increases, democracy in China has not reached the level many people expect. But obviously, from what you've just said, eventually any resistance will be quashed.
It's going to come from the other way up. But the local level, you do now vote for your local village chief. It's not much of a shift to say, what about the municipal level? What about the state level? And then what about national elections? I mean, it is an important shift. It'll be quite a dramatic shift. But when it happens, most positively for the markets, if you look at Korea, look at Taiwan, growth was uninterrupted. It is evolutionary. It's not revolutionary. When people shift political regime at this income level, it's peaceful. Which is why Tunisia was so much more peaceful than Egypt, much poorer, and Egypt was so much better than Syria, which is much poorer again. When you do shifts at poor income levels, it's destabilising and often bloody.
What about we've talked a lot about the internal considerations here. What about the external considerations, the geopolitics, the relationships with Japan, for example, and also with the United States of America? I mean, are they going to? Is there going to be any sort of easing of tensions between the United States and China, for example, on the currency factor?
The currency. I mean, the way I see China is it's a savings nation. It's like Japan, Germany, Switzerland. The Swiss franc just appreciated it continues to do for decades. The Deutschmark would have done. The yen will. I think the Chinese currency is a long-term one-way bet. In terms of tension with Japan, the only thing to be slightly concerned about Chinese democracy is it might be quite nationalist. That's been one of the growing forces in China in the last 20 years. It's growing pride, which is great, tinged with perhaps a little nationalism, which could be a little concerning.
A little nationalism. I mean, the extraordinary outpouring of violence against the Japanese during that recent spat, which is still going on. Charles, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks very much for popping in this lunchtime.